Good day, students. You're welcome to study session 8 of NSC 301, which will discuss epidemiological design strategies. In epidemiology, measuring the occurrence of disease or other health-related events in a population is only a beginning. Epidemiologists are also interested in assessing whether an exposure is associated with a particular disease or other outcome of interest. And in determining this, appropriate study design is needed to arrive at the accurate measurement. In this study session, you'll be introduced to study designs with its types, various observational designs in epidemiology, and types of experimental design. At the end of the study session, you'll be able to define study design with its types, be able to describe various observational designs in epidemiology, and be able to explain types of experimental design. What is a study design? Clinical study design is the formulation of trials and experiments, as well as observational studies in medical, clinical, and other types of research involving human beings. The first step in an epidemiological study is to define the hypothesis to be tested, and this should include a precise definition of the exposure and outcomes under study. The next step is to decide which study design will be the most appropriate to test that specific study hypothesis. Different study designs provide information of different quality. Of course, we always try to use the best possible design, but sometimes this is not practical or ethically acceptable. You cannot do an experiment to expose some people to a harmful substance to see what effect it has. Therefore, you need to understand the strengths and limitations of each type of study design as applied to a particular research purpose. Looking at the types of design, we have two major types of design. We have the observational and the experimental design. In observational study design, the researcher observes and systematically collects information, but does not try to change the people or animal or the reagent being observed. In an experimental study design, by contrast, the researcher will intervene to change something. For example, when you give drugs to a patient and you observe what happens. But in an observational study, there is no intervention. Observational designs allows nature to take its course. The investigator measures but does not intervene. They include studies that can be called descriptive or analytical. A descriptive study is limited to a description of the occurrence of a disease in a population and is often the first step in an epidemiological investigation, while an analytical study goes further by analyzing relationships between health status and other variables. Apart from the simplest descriptive studies, almost all epidemiological studies are analytical in character. Pure descriptive studies are rare, but descriptive data in reports of health statistics are a useful source of ideas for epidemiological studies. Observational studies can be divided into cross-sectional surveys, cohort studies, and case control studies. In cross-sectional studies, it measures the prevalence of disease and thus are often called prevalence studies. In a cross-sectional study, the measurement of exposure and the effects are made at the same time. It is not easy to assess the reason for association shown in cross-sectional studies. Data from cross-sectional studies are helpful in assessing the healthcare needs of populations. Data from repeated cross-sectional surveys using independent random samples with standardized definitions and survey method provide useful indications of trends. Cohort studies allows you to study changes and to establish the time sequence in which things occur. Therefore, you can use this to study causes. For example, you could draw a sample of people like the nursing student, for example, who do not have the disease you are interested in and collect information on the factor you have hypothesized to be a cause of the disease. The case control studies provides a relatively simple way to investigate causes of diseases, especially rare diseases. They include people with a disease of interest and a suitable control group of people unaffected by the disease or outcome variable. Moving to experimental designs, it can be divided into randomized control trials, that is the RCT, and the quasi-experimental design. The randomized clinical trial is the mainstay of experimental medical studies, normally used in testing new drugs and treatments. Samples of patients with the condition and who meet other selection criteria are randomly allocated to receive either the experimental treatment or the control treatment. Occasionally, a placebo or sham treatment will be used in the control group, but there is already an accepted treatment. It is unlikely to be ethical to use a placebo. In quasi-experimental design, there is an intervention, but is often not completely planned by the person doing the research. An example would be a study of the effect of removing ophthalmic services from the OHIP billing schedule. Is there a decrease in high testing after the change? A quasi-experimental study might record the number of eye exams per thousand population over the years up to the policy change and compare this pattern with the pattern afterwards. This is an observational study, but there was also an intervention, although it was not the experimenter who decided when and how the change would occur and to whom it would be applied. So this is a quasi-experiment. Thank you for listening. See you in the next lecture. Bye.